Creek Watershed District Board of Managers, February 13th, 2020. All managers are present except Manager Hitchmati, who will be here shortly, and Manager Rognus. The members of the public here are here for a specific item for the permit. So we will move on to approval of the agenda. There is one change I have to make, which is to add an action item at 11.3. We need to have a motion in open session to approve the salary increase for Mr. Whisker, and that's the addition. With that change, if there are no others, is there a motion to adopt the agenda?
Move approval. Second.
Second, Miller and Olson. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? On the consent agenda this evening, we have approval of the January 23rd board minutes and approval of Resolution 20-008, which is the LMCIT insurance renewal waiver. Is there a motion to adopt the consent agenda?
Move approval.
Manager Miller, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Maxwell, those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I have a couple of items for my report. I've gone to a couple of meetings. One was the legislative preview held by the Environmental Initiative. I went along with Ms. Moran. There was not much said about water. A couple of legislators said we need to keep water on the land, and Representative Wagenia said that the creek should not be flooding. That was pretty much all that was said about water. Then, as you know from the briefing we had in committee earlier, I went to the meeting yesterday with staff and Manager Maxwell at the City of Hopkins to sort of reinvigorate the collaboration we have going on there. So we will be meeting again in 2 weeks. And then on the 23rd of January, we conducted a performance review for the district administrator. We reviewed in some detail the progress in the various areas of work and how work is being done. We found ourselves to be very satisfied with Mr. Whisker's performance and with the functioning of the agency, and chose to increase his salary to $137,913.31, which is a 4.5% increase, and that's the motion I'll be looking for later to formalize that. I believe that is my report. And Operations and Programs Committee Manager Loftus.
Thank you, President White. We discussed 2 items. Mr. Heyman walked us through a request from MLJB for a license agreement on temporary storage. We also received an update on the meeting with Hopkins regarding a potential partnership agreement in the future. The second item we had was our outreach department, and we received an implementation plan that detailed the priorities and the operational plans moving forward. And there will likely be hiring action coming before the board in late February. And we ran out of time. Those were the 2 items we covered.
Thank you. Citizens Advisory Committee meeting report, and Manager Maxwell.
Yeah, that was last Wednesday. We had, I think it was 9 or 10 members there. First item they had was the election of a new chair and vice chair, and Reichenbacher as the chair, and then Bushnell as the vice chair, and Gerard and Saldet as the executive officers. And from there we had a discussion on from the staff about implementation of the process and time frame for the board to get involved with some of the steps in the committee that we're going to have, the Operating Program Committee. So that was then we're going to do that again February 27th, because we had a little meeting tonight. And let's see what else we talked about. Discussed the weather. We went to the website and discussed how the new website, how we're going to be more positioned. We're more of a news thing instead of just information. And we scheduled a couple of meetings for with the Citizens Advisory Committee to have a couple meetings with the staff and everything else to go over the web design, and those are going to be held in March 16th. And then on the web design, there was some talk about needs to be transparency, and districts should identify the website and focus on doing small things better than really scaling up and doing large things. And from there, we went on to some reports, and we're going to have Well, they discussed that the Minnesota Associated Watershed Districts is hit this summer in June. So we asked for some volunteers on that, and we have 4 volunteers that have come off, and I think the kickoff meeting for the meeting is going to be February 20th. That's been scheduled over the week, I think. And then from that, we talked about a meeting coming up in March for the Citizen Advisory, and that's going to be moved from March 4th to March 3rd, because they have a presentation by a climatologist, Kenny Blumfield. He's going to do a presentation. I think they're going to tape that too, so people want to watch that. And so the next meeting is going to be Tuesday, March 3rd, instead of Tuesday, March 4th.
Thank you. The upcoming meeting list is in the agenda. I note that it is Manager Miller who's assigned to the March CAC meeting, which we now know is March 4th, March 3rd. So we changed that there, March 3rd. Yeah. Then let's move on to item 10.1, which is the permit 19614, and Ms. Quinn.
Thank you, President White, board managers. Maybe you can, okay? This evening, permit 19614 is before you for consideration. As the Bakken Museum, as the applicant, has requested an exception from full compliance with the district's buffer provisions of the Wetland Protection Rule. Additionally, per resolution passed by the board that administers the Wetland Conservation Act to the district administrator, except for when an exception or variance is requested. So therefore, the WACA de minimis exemption application is also before you for consideration. So this evening, I will go over a project overview, rule analysis, the WACA application, exception request, and conclude with a staff recommendation. So the Bakken Museum is located at 3537 7th Avenue South in the city of Minneapolis. It is in the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District. It's located just west of Bay Makaska and just north of the stormwater ponds, which are located here. So I do want to spend just a little bit of time on the existing condition and a little bit of history of the site. So in 1997, the building addition that's outlined in black here, I have it as a plan set as an aerial, so you can kind of see it in both ways, was approved a district permit for stormwater management and wetland protection, and also received a variance to the buffer requirements at the time. So this green area is the historical wetland that was delineated in 1997. And then so kind of in that lighter green outline was the 16.5-foot wetland buffer that was required. The stormwater pond a little bit further to the east for rate control requirements. And the variance reduced the buffer width kind of on this side here to 9.5 feet. And then, so more recently, just this last October, a wetland boundary and type delineation was conducted, and the area kind of outlined in this green is now the entire area that meets wetland criteria, so the historical wetland has expanded quite a bit. And then I just want to also walk you through how drainage works on the site in the current condition. The parking lot area here will drain to the stormwater pond, and then prior to discharging out into the city storm sewer. And then this area here, outlets about right here, and then kind of just goes directly into the wetland and then through the rest of the site. So the Bakken Museum is proposing to implement a new elevated concrete walkway, patio area, and steps, which are highlighted in blue here. The applicant's stated need of the project is to improve the visitor experience, increase awareness of the museum, and to also further programming to develop educational programming and signage relative to the wetlands and the natural resources. So they really value the natural resources they have on the site, and they want to bring the user kind of a little bit more interactive with that. So the proposed increase in impervious surface requires review under the district's erosion control, stormwater management, and protection laws. For the purposes of the presentation, I'm not going to go through the erosion control rule, but do have a slide prepared if any of the managers have a question. And so I'm going to transition into the stormwater management requirements. So for the size of the site and the proposed increase in impervious surface, under the district's rule, they're required to treat the new impervious area, which is shown in blue there, which is 5,880 square feet. And they're required to meet volume, phosphorus, and rate controls for that. So to meet the district's volume control requirement, they'd have to provide 980 cubic feet of treatment. They're proposing a filtration basin here, which will actually filter just over 20,000 cubic feet. And then they're also proposing 2 baffle pumps outlined in black there, which is like a sump basin as a pre-treatment to get additional sediment removal. So they've shown that they'll meet the volume control requirement based on calculations that were submitted and reviewed by staff and the engineer. Phosphorus removal requirement would be 0.2 pounds per year. They're achieving 0.8 pounds per year with what they're proposing. And they have demonstrated conformance with the district's rate control requirements that would be leaving the site, which are shown in the blue area there. So just to kind of clarify what they are treating here is this entire existing parking lot, which was required to meet rate control, but now they're bringing it up into conformance with the current stormwater requirements, and they're exceeding what we would require, just through the regulation as it stands. So with what they've provided and the conditions in the report, they meet the stormwater management rule. And then I thought this was a nice image of, as we transition into the Wetland Conservation Act. So the yellow line shown there is the wetland boundary that was delineated just this last October. And you can see the 2 inlets that come in from the site here and here. And through that boundary and type review, staff and Bowser agreed that the area in the green, so that 1997 wetland, would be the area of wetland that's regulated under the Wetland Conservation Act, and the rest of it was found to meet incidental status. So what that means is a wetland that takes on characteristics, but they're caused by man-made activities, and they're not regulated then under the Wetland Conservation Act. And so this is just a Google Street image that it says it was taken in May of 2019. It's like facing the museum, so Lake Calhoun would be behind you. Just to kind of show the board that it's definitely wet in high precipitation and does meet those wetland criteria. So moving into the de minimis exemption application. So under the WACA and under the de minimis exemption provisions, certain types of impacts in certain geographies to wetlands don't require replacement. So for this particular area, it's a type 1 wetland. It's within 1,000 feet of a water body, so it's considered in the shoreland overlay district. And the proposed impacts are outside of the building setback. So under those provisions, the allowable amount of impact without requiring mitigation or replacement would be 400 square feet. Excuse me. And they've submitted an application that shows that they'll be impacting 370 square feet of this wetland. And I'd like to point out that the application actually also includes that little kind of blacked out area on the screen. So that area has actually been found to not require regulation under WACA. However, since the historical boundary wasn't surveyed presently, they used the flags in the field for the survey and quantified their impact off that. So really their 370 square feet of impact is kind of an overestimation, but they're still below the threshold that they would be allowed to do in the exemption. Staff and Bowser staff have reviewed the application and find that the 370 square feet of impact overall meet the de minimis exemption criteria, and staff recommends the board approve the WACA application. So moving into the district's wetland protection rules. So the wetland protection rule applies whenever there's a proposed impact to a wetland, and then also the buffer provisions of the rule are triggered when there's impact, or also when stormwater management's required. The district's rule does recognize all the exemptions under WACA, and therefore no wetland replacements required under the district's rule if the de minimis exemption is approved. And the buffer provisions are applied. The district's functional assessment of wetlands did not have this wetland inventoried, so the applicant submitted a MinRAM analysis, which was reviewed by staff and Bowser and proved to be a managed 2 classification, which corresponds to a 30-foot wetland buffer. As you can see on this figure here, they are employing buffer averaging. Oh. Excuse me. They're employing buffer averaging, and so the required buffer area that they're showing on this figure of about 11,000 square feet is actually more than what we would require because the buffer is limited by the south property line. And as is outlined in the report, I believe they're required to provide approximately over 8,000 square feet of wetland buffer, and they are exceeding that and providing a little bit over 9,000 square feet. And then they have met the averaging requirements for the minimum buffer width of 15 feet out to 16 feet, with the exception of providing, they're not meeting the minimum buffer width here for 96 linear feet on the west side of the wetland, in which they have requested that the board consider an exception for. And so to remind the Board of Managers to consider and approve an exception, the applicant must demonstrate that the project is achieving a greater natural resource benefit than strict compliance with the rule. And then to just remind the board, the policy of the wetland protection rule is to achieve no net loss of wetlands, and then to increase wetland quantity, quality, and biological diversity. So staff have reviewed the materials and exception application provided. And so just to remind everybody that the area outlined in blue here is the proposed increase in impervious. They're providing filtration of that entire area shown in red, which is excess of, excuse me, my little notes tab on my PowerPoint is not working. They're providing an additional 0.34 acres of impervious surface treatment, which would then drain to that rate control pond before it discharges off site. They are also providing additional wetland buffer area than what's required, and how water does move on this site, it would filter through that more eastern wetland buffer before leaving the site. And then I just wanted to kind of summarize some of those things for the board as well. So they're treating additional impervious surface. They're actually achieving 3 times the amount of total phosphorus and TSS removals per year than what would be required. They're creating they've created additional wetland buffer, and the wetland on site has actually increased by about 133% from the 1997 condition. So staff have reviewed those materials and would recommend to the board that with those additional treatments provided, they have met the intent of the wetland protection rule by increasing the quality of the wetland and also increasing the biological diversity of the area. And with that, staff find that the applicant has provided sufficient evidence for the board to consider the exception. And I also would like to just note that the conditions listed in the permit report, I would like to add one more that was omitted by error, and that is submission of the financial assurance to meet the stormwater management rule. And so with that, I'll move to a recommendation. So staff recommend approval of the WACA de minimis exemption, find that the applicant has provided sufficient evidence for the board to consider the exception request to not meeting the minimum buffer with requirement of 15 feet for 96 linear feet, and then approval of the permit application.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn. First, we'll divide it into those three parts. Is there a motion to approve the exception to allow for buffer averaging? Manager Miller, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Maxwell, any questions for Ms. Quinn? Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Next, we will look at that exemption for the de minimis determination. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Manager
Second.
Maxwell, second by Manager Miller. Question?
Yeah, was there somebody here that, in opposition to it, or just support?
Two members of the public are here, but they're, one is with the Bakken,
They're both with the Bakken
both with the
Museum.
Bakken, okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Manager Miller, I will note, I did not receive any public comments during the public notice period.
Thank you.
Thank you. Manager Loftus?
Could I just ask you a question from my understanding? Is there structure going into the existing wetland in those two corners?
Yes. So,
Are there risks, not only for them,
Manager
and,
Loftus.
I mean, they're truly impacting the wetland there? So those two corners are,
Yep, so
I mean, are
these,
those generally dry? I mean, I don't know why you'd,
Manager Loftus, board manager's great question. There will be a retaining wall built here, so this is an elevated walkway. And so it is not dry right now, I will say. Like this is a saturated area.
and what's the rationale for not keeping it within the outside of the wetland?
For not keeping it here. So, Manager Loftus, board managers, I've worked with the Bakken Museum staff. I went out to review the wetland boundary and type in October, and that was when they kind of presented me with the idea that they were looking at doing this addition to improve the visitor experience. And so we worked with them to really minimize the amount of impact. They were initially proposing more, and get it underneath that threshold for the WACA de minimis. So the intent of the WACA de minimis is that there's certain amounts of impact that you can do without requiring mitigation, because it's not really seen as it's going to negatively affect the overall function and quality of the wetland itself. And that's what those provisions are all outlined in the
So
wetland
putting a structure
conservation.
into the wetland doesn't impact it?
I would say they're going to be bringing in fill to stabilize the soils here.
Okay.
And would kind of further say that they have received city approvals for the buildings, and that would be more in the purview of the city review structural engineer.
And I'm not trying to design their walkway, but why can't it follow the line of the wetland? Why does it have to jut into the wetland? I don't understand.
For the exact dimensions of the walkway, is that, I just want to make sure I'm understanding your
Yeah,
question.
why can't they
properly.
design-
Blue area here.
Why can't they design it so it stays on that side?
Could we call for someone to come from the Bakken and answer the question?
Madam Chair, while we're waiting for them to step up.
Yes.
Heidi, can you, for the record, you added a condition, recommended condition on the financial assurance. And if I remember a phone call right, the amount is $400.
Correct, yes.
So that's the added condition.
So I'm Michael Sanders, I'm the president of the Bakken Museum. So I think your question is why, let me make sure I'm clear on this. Is it why there's a walkway of that size, or the
Or
shape of
why
it?
the shape, why you can round it out and keep it out of the wetland? Was there some specific thought process or
Yeah, so there's,
hardship where you can't, you have to have these two corners in there?
yeah, just for a little background, that entrance that you're seeing there, that is essentially, yeah, that where the
Yeah.
pointer is right now, that's a new entrance, that's not existing. Right now, that's a window. So this walkway is all new, basically to accommodate the changes that we're doing to the entrance of the building, to reorient the building towards the wetland and the lake. And the idea is that we have not just this new walkway, but that it's programmatic space, that we are, when I arrived 5 years ago, it became apparent that the building was built without the idea of leveraging this amazing site for the programmatic purposes of highlighting the wetland and talking about the wetland and the lake and the history and things like that. And we're a museum that exists for those education purposes. And so it's not just a walkway, it's also a place that we envision classes and tours and things like that. So there has to be a minimum size so that there can still be ingress into the building, but also allow for a small group of students to be out there and part of the wetland. And so, as Heidi was saying, we originally looked at it potentially being larger without knowing what the impact would be on the wetland. And it was after working with Heidi and some others that realized, well, we don't want to have that huge negative impact on the wetland, and bring it back to as small as we can get, but still fulfill those mission-based needs of our organization.
Well, I appreciate the intent of what you're doing, and that most of the drainage is coming through a buffer area, but I struggle that there's zero buffer on that side, and in fact, there's physical structure going into it. Apparently, there's not maybe a scientific reason that that can't happen, but it's not protecting the wetland, in my opinion, so I struggle with that.
Mayor Jalakis, I think I understand.
Excuse
what
me,
you- oh, sorry.
Ms. Quinn, did you have more to say?
I didn't, I just, so you know, my opinion and my vote is gonna reflect that. I think you could change that design to get out of the wetland, and I think wetlands are worth protecting. I appreciate all the other reasons that you have it that way, but in my opinion, you could design it to have those two corners outside of the wetland, and
Ms.
I don't
Quinn?
understand the hardship for it, so thank you.
Ms. Quinn?
Mayor Jalakis, I would like to just point out too that with that approved variance back in 1997, the wetland buffer that currently exists here is 9.5 feet, and since the wetland has grown, the pinch point here is about 2 feet from the wetland boundary. And that, also, if they were to completely avoid wetland impacts, they would still be asking for a variance to not meet the
Yeah, I understand that there isn't gonna be any buffer at all, but if my vote is that there wouldn't be a physical structure constructed into a wetland. I understand there won't be a buffer. I think that's going too far.
Thank you. Would you outline again what is the incidental wetland?
Absolutely. President White.
It's all the middle.
This figure here. So the entire hatched area and the stormwater pond meet incidental criteria. The yellow line is what was delineated in the fall.
So the diagonal pink lines, that's the incidental wetland?
And the stormwater pond.
Okay. And you indicated, and those lines seem to indicate that that wetland grew.
So the yellow line is the line that meets wetland criteria. So if we didn't have a record showing that there was this historical wetland of that size from that permit, that entire area within that yellow outline would be regulated under the Wetland Conservation Act.
Other questions?
Well, to scale it back, how small does it have to be then? Is there a square footage there that you scale it back to, or without the retaining walls?
I'm sorry, I missed it.
Some of it, you make it small without a wall, there's gonna have to be framed back. Are you losing X amount of square feet?
For the walkway?
Yeah.
Guess I'm not following the question.
So is how many square feet of walkway, how much is
Impacted by,
Would
into
you
the wetland?
lose
Yeah.
to pull
Yeah.
it out of the wetland?
That I'm not sure. We'd have to go back to the drawings.
Manager Maxwell, yeah, that would probably be a question for their consulting engineer, because they'd have to look at how much, they'd have to pull back the retaining wall area as well, and how that would impact the square footage. I think currently the walkway itself is about 3,000 square feet, approximately.
Manager Miller?
I'm trying to remember. This is way lower than the sidewalk.
I'm sorry, Manager.
The wetland is way
Yes,
lower than
it's below the
sidewalk.
sidewalk. Yeah.
So
Yes.
it doesn't affect the storage capacity. You know, and,
You're saying the walkway could flood?
huh? It'll just be higher. It isn't gonna flood neighborhood properties or anything.
Understand. So your structure is going to be able to withhold additional water running up against it, which is
Yes, it's actually going to
fine.
be
Yeah,
above.
I understand that.
Any other questions? Are we ready to vote? We are looking at the exemption for the wetland. Is there a motion to approve?
Move approval.
Did I do this already? I already did
You
this,
did
didn't I?
one.
You're right to questions.
I wasn't quite sure what the first motion was.
We had the exception, and I moved to the exemption. And I don't remember if I had motion or not, but now I do.
You
Yeah.
did. It was the opposite.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nay.
One opposed. Thank you. And moving now to the permit with the exception, the exemption, and the stated conditions, as well as the additional condition that there would be a $400 financial assurance for the stormwater management. Is there a motion to approve?
Move approval.
Manager Miller, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Olson, further discussion? Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. We'll move to item 11.1, Resolution 20009, Mr. Langer.
Good evening, President White, Board of Managers. Tonight I bring forth authorization for contract services to pursue winter commercial seining within 6 Mile Creek. One note before I get started, there is a typo in the resolution, so I set forth on each of your spots an update to that, which notes a change in who is contracting with. It's supposed to be WSB and Associates versus Carp Solutions.
Can I ask a question for a second? Is that the same outfit that did the Edina, Richfield treatment plant?
It is.
I'm not going to support this.
We'll come around to discussion. You can give us your reasons. Mr. Langer, go ahead.
Maybe you're bringing it in.
We'll let Mr. Langer detail his rationale. I think the group that we're working with essentially on cart management, there's very few outfits that are doing that work. We've worked with them before on this. It's not a civil engineering group that we're working with, but we'll take your questions part of the discussion.
Mr. Linger, briefly, hi, for one, we've met Matt. There are actually 2 contracts, the total amount of which is correct, and they're both with WSB. They're for 2 different lakes, which I'm sure Mr. Linger is about to explain.
Yes.
With all that preamble, go ahead, Mr. Langer.
Thank you. So yes, I would like to start off with giving an update, a background of the 6 Mile Creek Halsted Bay Habitat Restoration Project, progress to date and where we stand. Within that, moving into the carp removal technique review that we performed and where we're at in that, ultimately moving forward with removable recommendations and the request for board action on 2 contracts within the provided authorization. Starting off, background, so in 2014 to 2016, Minnehaha Creek partnered with the University of Minnesota to conduct a common carp assessment within 6 Mile Creek. Simplistically put, the project identified that common carp were a concern within the subwatershed. The drivers of carp existing within the watershed were, one, their ability to migrate in from Lake Minnetonka into the Parley Mud region of the subwatershed, and secondly was the ability within the upper part of the watershed, the ability of carp to recruit within that. When I say recruit, just for clarification, that is a spawned egg becoming an adult later, not just laying of the egg. So that subtle difference with what recruitment is. Ultimately, the report also outlined 3 different strategies to remediate this carp concern within the subwatershed. One was to prevent that recruitment. Second was to block immigration into the system by adults. And lastly was to remove carp from the system. In 2017, the district pursued a Lessard Sam Outdoor Heritage Council grant, which was received. It took a holistic approach to managing the carp. One of those was to prevent the recruitment, and to do that, aeration was thought to be a technique to do that. To date, we've supplied power to all sites that we foresee needing aeration, and that would be Mud, North Lunston, and South Lunston. We're currently testing out aeration within Mud as we speak to get an understanding of how the operations maintenance of that work, the impact it might be having. And secondly, we're monitoring dissolved oxygen within the Lunstons as a effort to any aeration that might proceed in the future so that we can know what the impact aeration is having. The second infrastructure was barriers. 3 of 4 permanent structures have been implemented to date. To highlight those locations, the first one is the Highland Barrier, the second, Crown College, and the third one is the Wasserman. Currently, a 4th one is being proposed, with more to come on that later, but it's this Auburn-Lunston barrier. You'll note a few other barriers are presented on this map, this North Lunston Parley. This was in place before the beginning of the study and this Lessard Sam's grant. It's on Three Rivers Park District property, and it just operated as a water level control weir structure. And then another proposed location, this is just for the use of temporary blockage of carp that try to get from Pearson's Lake into marsh, where historically we've done some spring trapping. So just to call out the other locations. And then the last part of the Lessard Sam's grant was, again, that adult removal. We're in the progress of doing that with more updates coming here. So to date, we've actually observed reduction in all systems moving towards our Lessard Sam's goal, which on this figure is that green line, that 100 kilograms per hectare threshold. How have we gotten there? Well, we've gotten there in 2 parts. One, our own efforts in pursuing removals. To date, we've removed close to 81,000 pounds of carp out of the system. And then we've also had Mother Nature help us. So some of the systems are shallow enough that they can be susceptible to what is known as winter kill. The systems become deprived of oxygen, which actually causes the fish to die. The 2 cases that I've highlighted in red here, Wasserman is a great example of how our efforts to remove carp and install barriers have actually suppressed a high density of carp down to something that's meeting our Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Fund goal, where Turbid Lake is one where Mother Nature took care of it for us. So the focus of the grant now moving forward in 2020 and 2021 through the remaining years is to continue removing so that we can hopefully meet the removal targets in all of these systems. How are we going to get there? We've currently vetted 4 methods. These methods have been pursued in areas outside of the watershed district, so there's some familiarity and knowledge about those. So from there, we've been able to kind of highlight just different cost and the amount of effort it takes to conduct each of these methods. Multiple methods are under consideration because not all methods are effective for each system. So in other words, we need a variety of tools for a given system or even an individual lake to really resolve our issues. So throughout this, our approach has been to try to also minimize the risk in what is a risky venture. They are fish, they don't want to be caught, so they try to evade us, so we have to be smart and tactful. How have we gone about minimizing this risk in method selection? Kind of three main tiers. First is really determine the strategies for methods on each lake. For example, if carp don't migrate in and out of that system, stream trapping is not a viable method. So we gave a lot of consideration to the number of carp, the migration patterns, the aggregations. Do carp school up in these systems to really vet out what options are feasible? A second thing we did was review the effectiveness of the methods we've pursued to date. So with some of the reasoning we selected the methods to pursue, were they actually effective in the returns that we got and comparing to each other? And then recently in January, we reached out to multiple consulting firms, Wank, WSB, and Carp Solutions, to receive input on not only our own strategies, seek if there were other strategies that might exist that we weren't thinking of, and to also solicit and see if they had the ability to assist on removals. So through this process, what we're bringing forth tonight is kind of proposals for two different systems, Zumbra and Parley Lakes, and we're proposing the idea of winter removal at this time on those systems. A little bit of background for Parley Lake. Why was Parley Lake selected as a candidate to pursue winter seining? This is the lake with the highest abundance of carp. Not only does it contain Parley Lake carp, it also receives mud lake carp that swim into it in the winter because it's a deeper lake. So the system has roughly 37,000 carp in it as we speak. We've attempted box netting. This last year we gave quite an extensive effort, and though we were able to remove carp at what appeared to be very shocking densities when they pulled in the nets, with that many carp, it's a drop in the bucket. This system also forms very dense winter aggregates. You can see from the photo image, those little yellow and pink dots with numbers around them is an example of the aggregates in the winter from the university, or the study of 2014 and 2016. This is also a lake that commercial fishermen do have interest in. So as noted previously, commercial fishermen have rights and territories across the state. The commercial fisherman in this area has interest in this lake. The issues that we've run into in the past is the ability to contract directly with that commercial fisherman for insurance purposes. So the proposal for Parley Lake that's coming forward tonight is working with WSB. WSB's fees on this project are really playing coordinator and communicator between us, themselves, and the commercial fishermen, while also managing the expectations that we're setting forth so that we ensure we're making progress. The total commercial fisherman fees could total $14,000 on this, but I'm going to break that down here, what that all entails. So the commercial fisherman on Parley Lake will be Don Geyer. Don Geyer has proposed a structure fee where $1,500 is for a flat fee for mobilization and demobilization. This is basically all the effort to get to the site, get it prepared to actually put a net underwater, drag it under the ice, and remove all the fish that might come with it. So it's a lot of netting, a lot of heavy equipment that needs to be under that. Then for actually conducting the seine haul, he's proposed a $2,500 seine haul attempt fee. And then on top of that, he's proposed the idea of a bounty. So in other words, for every pound of carp he gets, he's asking for a quarter of compensation up to $10,000. So this contract structure really actually backloads the payment. In other words, if he's very successful at getting carp out, he gets rewarded for that. So along this, we also want to try to minimize unneeded or unnecessary expenses. So what we're gonna do or propose to do is check the aggregation of carp, meaning are they actually schooled up in an area that we believe seining can be successful? So we are doing that before we even approve or green light the first phase of removal. The first phase would consist of, again, snow plowing, site prep for the seine haul. At that point, due to all the activity of plowing and such, that can cause the carp to spook and leave the area. So we will then go back out and check to confirm that the carp stayed in that area, in which case green lighting phase 2 and phase 3 of that. So now moving over to Lake Zumbra. Lake Zumbra was selected also due to its high abundance of carp. We've attempted box netting, so we have a level of comparison. Unlike Parley, this lake does not actually experience any carp migration, so it limits the techniques that we can pursue. Winter aggregations also form. However, this lake is unknown to commercial fishermen. They haven't historically sought to come to this lake. And Don Geyer, who is the territory, who has the territory rights to this area, has said he does not want to do it. So again, the structure here it has WSB planning coordinator communicating, but because this isn't a lake that the territory commercial fisherman is willing to go into, the ability to find another commercial fisherman requires additional permitting, which WSB is taking, has offered to take that on to file and get submitted and accepted by the DNR. And then there's the commercial fisherman fee that can total up to $15,000. To break down the commercial fishing structure, so this is Jeff Riedemann Commercial Fishing. Jeff Riedemann has proposed a fee schedule that is $2,500 per day for mobilization and demobilization activities, a $5,000 fee for seine haul attempts, but he has not asked for any form of bounty. So this is a much more front-loaded type contract where, because it's unknown, it's more difficult. He's asked for that form of structure. So we've worked with that payment structure to, again, try to insert our ability to check the aggregation and therefore able to have some form of control or installment along the way to mitigate the expenses. So phase 1 would consist of snow plowing, site prep. We would check again if the carp stayed aggregated. We would green light pre-lining and prep. So pre-lining is a bunch of hole drilling and getting the site ready for actually deploying the net underneath the ice, at which point we would check the aggregation. If it stayed in place, approve or green light the seine haul, which goes with phases 3 through 5 at that point. So in summary, we continue to navigate the carp removal with attempting to minimize risk while vetting options. Winter seining can be a cost-effective method when the option is available, the site is appropriate, and the carp are schooled. However, we also want to acknowledge that this isn't the only method that we're pursuing within the watershed. We do have some upcoming board action items with the idea of targeting the spring time frame and also the summer time frame with different types of removal techniques. Ultimately tonight, moving forward with asking the board for authorization to execute contract with WSB for winter seining removal services for an amount not to exceed $39,478 and broken down into 2 separate contracts as noted earlier, one for Parley Lake and one for Lake Zumbra. Thank you.
Is there a motion to adopt the resolution 2009?
So moved.
Manager Olson, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Loftus, now questions.
No question, I'm not voting for any contracts with WSB until they resolve the Richfield problem. I was on the board, advocated for it, they promised all this success and didn't achieve it, which can happen. but they don't seem to be trying to resolve it in any timely fashion. You know, a very expensive project, we'll be paying for it for another 15 years, and I'm just not willing to overlook that breach of professional success, I guess.
Thank you. Are there other questions, Manager Loftus?
I appreciate your principles, but does this fall within the budget that we've set forward for this project?
Manager Loftus, good question. It does. The removal portion of this project consisted of approximately $304,000. So we're making progress. We still have funds to expense through the remainder of the grant period, and I think this would comprise roughly 13% of that overall budget.
So is it more than we thought we'd spend on this or less? I know that the market was a bit of an unknown,
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem unreasonable to me, but I don't know what the initial thoughts were when we first walked into this.
It's a lot more than the Boy Scouts charged.
Yeah.
Manager Loftus, great question. I guess I don't know quite the onset beginning of the entire grant, but I think at the onset there was a lot of unknowns and uncertainties.
Yeah.
And that was in the thought of developing a considerable budget around removals, knowing that it would take some attempts to learn how effective these tested methods otherwhere were within 6 Mile Creek's watershed, and the attempt to minimize that. So,
Okay, thanks for all your work on it.
Manager Olson?
Got a question. Are we still using the tags to determine where they are?
Manager Olson, you're talking there's 2 different forms of tags. So yes, probably the ones you're referencing are the radio frequency tags.
Yes.
The bigger tags that were surgically implanted. Yes, we are. So that's how we're going out when we say we're checking the aggregation. We're trying to locate those tags in where they exist in the lake, and again, if they've actually formed this dense aggregation.
So are we giving that information to Guy, or is that how it works?
Yes, we will be communicating the information to WSB, allowing them to coordinate and facilitate.
Okay. Thanks.
Other questions? We are not contracting directly with Geyer or, I forget the other man's name.
Jeff Friedemann.
We're just contracting with WSB?
Correct. And on these 2 projects, again, the territory rights and the desire by the commercial fishermen, the work would then be subbed out to those commercial enterprises.
Okay.
Within the dollar amounts that
Right.
Anything else? Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
No. And I want the record to reflect that I will not vote for another contract with WSP until we get satisfactory response on the Ridgefield project. We still owe $1.5 million on that project. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Langer.
Thank you, board managers, president.
Next, item 11.2, Ms. Brown has resolution 20010.
Thank you, President White, managers. I am seeking tonight approval of the amendment to the purchase agreement for the Wasserman Lake Park project. You'll note that there's a red line copy in front of you on this one as well. I had originally drafted it to say that you were approving the purchase agreement and the easement, but in consultation with legal counsel, approving that amendment to the purchase agreement constitutes approval of both of those documents. So again, there are those 2 actions sort of embedded in your approval this evening. The first, the amendment to the purchase agreement, is sort of predetermined through that second cooperative agreement. The board will recall that when we approved the second cooperative agreement with the City of Victoria, we modified the terms of closing on the property so that the closing wouldn't occur until we had awarded the construction contract. So the purchase agreement needed to be modified and updated to reflect that change. The second matter are some revisions to the easement.
The first cooperative agreement with the City of Victoria only provided for easement on the wetland areas. As we were entering the second phase of design and the second phase cooperative agreement, we knew that our work would also encompass the stream channel. So when the second cooperative agreement was approved, the easement was modified to also include that stream channel area. Then through design, we also determined that we'd be making investment in other portions of the property, namely the woodland and the prairie mound in the sort of the center area of the park. And so with that, we had discussed with the board wanting to seek some type of covenant structure or some type of protection over those investment areas. The city preferred to manage the covenant by just sort of incorporating natural areas into the easement itself, which provide for us to access and maintain those areas, as well as requires any modification to those areas to be agreed upon between the district and the city. And so the easement has been updated to reflect that. I'll note that the natural areas portion of the easement does have a 30-year automatically renewing term. So after 30 years, it could be terminated. We estimate that there's relatively little risk of that occurring, but most of those natural areas are also encompassed in wetland buffer. So even if that were terminated, it would still be largely protected. This amendment was approved by City Council at their meeting this past Monday. And then I would also note that if the board approves this amendment this evening, the property closing will occur within 21 days of the construction contract being awarded. Before I turn over for discussion, I just wanted to give a couple of quick updates on the Wasserman project. The winter work, the oak work and the boardwalk. The oak work is complete, and the boardwalk construction will be starting in the next couple of weeks. So that work is well underway. City Council also took action on Monday to formally change the name of the park to Wasserman Lake Preserve, which I think is nice and sort of serves our interest in keeping this area in a natural state long term. And finally, we did have the bids come in on Tuesday, and they came in quite favorably, and so that will be coming back for action on the 27th. And so with that, again, we're seeking approval of the amendment to the Wasserman Lake Park, soon to be Wasserman Lake Preserve purchase agreement.
Move approval. Second.
Motion Miller, second Olson. Any questions from Ms. Brown? Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
I think that's kind of important, changing that name, because I think it distinguishes between, park, playground, to natural environment. And I really want to commend you for accomplishing that. That's very good.
Thank you.
And
Part of our, what would they call it, branding?
It parallels the work in the creek in St. Louis Park.
Right.
Yeah. Anything else?
Okay, that is it.
Thank you very much. Then we'll move to the added item 11.3. I'm looking for a motion to approve the salary for Mr. Whisker for 2020 of $137,913.31.
Move approval.
Manager Miller, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Olson? Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
If he brings up WSP again, I won't rule. You're on notice.
Remember that for next year's performance review. Okay, that's enough comedy, Sherry. Item 13.1 is an update on the Cart Barrier construction update, and that is Ms. Brown again.
Okay, thank you again, President White and managers. I wanted to give an update on the quote process for the fourth barrier, the Auburn barrier. But since we're talking about it coming in over budget and how we're going to adjust, I thought it would be useful to just provide a quick update on where we are with the program budget as a whole. So you can see here line item by line item, we've spent a little over half of our adult carp removal funds available. We have completed our utility installation and completed all of that work under budget with about 10,000 remaining. And then with the barriers, we've completed Highland, Wasserman, and Crown College. Highland did come in a little bit under budget, but we are looking to do some retrofits of that barrier to fix the fencing material where we've had some maintenance issues. So that will likely end up being sort of on track with budget when all that maintenance is said and done. And you can see here that we had allocated 30,000 for the Auburn-Lunston barrier. So I thought that might be useful context as we sort of walk through what's next with that Auburn barrier. So as the board will recall, we had intended to construct that fourth and final barrier this winter. We approved design in December, solicited quotes in January. We received one quote for that barrier construction, but it came back quite a bit over the allocated fund amount, more than $20,000 over. We brought the contractor in to talk about it and see if there was maybe some value engineering that we could do. And it seems that the overage is largely due to site conditions. There is a lot of water moving through that channel right now. So it's a lot deeper than it would be under typical conditions. And the water remains open around that area where ideally they'd be doing the work installing on ice. What he said to us is that we're sort of thinking about it more in terms of the Wasserman barrier, but in terms of actual site conditions and difficulty to install, it's more akin to like the Highland barrier, just in difficulty of installation. So there are a number of variables at play here and sort of knobs that we can dial, but given kind of the short winter construction window, we'd like to postpone construction until next winter so that we can take sort of an intentional look at the design, at the location, at the budget, and make sure that we're sort of making the right design in the right place for the right amount of money. So again, we'll be looking at several options moving forward. We can request a rebudget from Lessard Sams, looking at where the money's been spent and where there is money. We could draw from some of that, those remaining funds for utility installation, for example, and possibly go into some of the removal budget, depending on how much we're looking at reallocating. But there is still remaining some flexibility in the Lessard Sams budget, and they, I think, would be likely to approve an amendment given the circumstances. But prior to sort of getting there, we'd like to take just a more critical look at whether there's a way to better manage the site conditions, or if there is a modified design that might still get us what we need but not present the same installation challenges. So in the meantime, we are going to put a temporary barrier in place. So that'll still achieve what we need it to achieve for this year. It'll block fish. We plan to still use it to do some stream trapping in that channel. And that'll kind of buy us the year to figure out what we're doing next for that barrier.
Thank you. Are there questions for Ms. Brown?
No pictures.
I was trying to do a Google thing, but
It's right here.
yeah, there you go.
Carp pictures.
It's not even close to a road, is it?
Manager Olson, there is the road by the Auburn boat launch does go by right
Okay.
there, so it's pretty adjacent to the culvert there. So we would have created sort of a construction access.
Long crane to reach way out rather than crawl in there. Okay,
Well, thank you for the update. Appreciate it.
thank you.
Mr. Whisker, you're on.
Yes, President White, managers, I've got 3 items for everybody tonight for the administrator's report. The Watershed District, along with Jonathan Kusa from Interfluve, Chris Meehan from Wank, and Lewis Smith from Smith Partners have been accepted as part of a 90-minute panel at the International LID Conference, the Low Impact Development Conference that is put on by the American Society of Civil Engineers. This year that'll be in Bethesda, Maryland. It's a 90-minute panel, describing how we implemented the Greenway through collaboration with our public and private partners. So the way that that's been positioned is Interfluve, as our stream geomorphologist, would talk about all the stream ecology. Chris from Wank would be talking about civil and stormwater. Lewis would be talking about partnership development, risk management, and I'd potentially be there talking about how we've built all those partnerships and turned that into a sort of the Watershed District's business model through balanced urban ecology. The next item that I wanted to cover is, as you know, the operations program is going to be undergoing some more transition. Ms. Reynolds will be leaving the district on February 20th, so we wanted to first of all thank her for her service and all she's done for our operations and wish her well as she moves on. And then just very briefly outline the basic moves for the transition plan that I've been working through with Deb Johnson, the Assistant Operations Manager. Generally, the work in operations, for sake of simplicity, we've broken down in terms of information technology, facilities management, human resources, budget, financing, accounting. And the broad brushstrokes are that the information technology, the project planning will be pulled to the IT team, including, as we discussed very briefly in committee, just an evaluation of our current managed services provider and IT governance. Help desk, which we sort of run through an e-ticket or our on-site help desk work that happens bi-weekly, is going to continue to be coordinated by Deb. In terms of facilities management, just sort of the routine management of the building, that all sits with her right now, so not much of a change there. And as you know, the campus improvements that we're planning, that we're in design for, or going to be in design for soon, are being pulled out and are being implemented by our project planning group, headed up by Laura Damjancic. So we have some coverage there. In terms of the human resource bracket, there's not too much. There's basic onboarding, offboarding that would potentially shift to Deb. We do have employee benefit renewal coming up, so I'll be working with our benefit broker to look at the numbers, see how we sit in budget, and that's something that I'll be working on with her. So I think the biggest shift will be in accounting, finance, and I've been meeting with Kathy and Deb, and they've put together a good plan, spoken with Deb, and she's willing to sort of step up and fill some of the procedural roles with accounts payable, help work with me, Abdo Ike Myers and our auditor to make sure the audit goes smooth, and then we'll be thinking about the budget planning as we look forward to April 23rd, our budget forecast for 2021, how we're going to work together on that. I think the take home is I've sat down a couple times with Deb and Kathy, and in coordinating with Deb, she's recommended, and I generally agree, that we not immediately backfill. That seems to be part of our pattern around here, to just take the opportunity to transition the work, see how we reach a new equilibrium, and determine what changes or improvements we need to make sort of once everything reaches a new normal. So we'll be doing that over a 30, 60, 90-day period, assessing as we go. I'll report back to the board. You'll let me know if there's issues on your end in terms of service that you're getting for board packets, your interface with operations, that sort of thing. And then we'll make a decision on what adjustments we need to make long-term after that. So there's that. And then the last item is we do have another position transitioning. Chase Vanderbilt, who's our research and monitoring field assistant, he's going to be leaving for Coon Creek as a monitoring specialist. So similarly, we want to wish him well as he joins our friends over at Coon Creek. And also similarly, I'll be working with Brian to assess the research and monitoring needs over the next month or two and determine how quickly we need to backfill. You might recall from my performance review, we discussed a couple different areas this year that through the budget process we might look at evaluation or adjustment. And there's, might be an opportunity to make some minor structural adjustments within the research and monitoring program. So that's something we're going to take a month or so to just dig into with Brian, and then report back to the board on whether we keep things the way they are or make an adjustment there. So those are the three things I have for you, and as always, happy to answer your questions.
Ms. Reynolds, I wanted to just wish you the very best in you, wherever you land next, and thank you for the time you've been here, and we thank Mr. Vanderbilt as well. We are adjourned. Mr. Welch, would you like me not to adjourn?
I had a comment.
Manager Miller?
Several months ago, I asked about some items that were left in the air, and I'd like to kind of keep current on that, and that's the Richfield project. And I'm not going to forget about that one, in spite of the fact it's complicated and messy. So I'd like a report on that at the next meeting or whenever you can. And also, that project that we did at the Arboretum, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago now, it's embarrassing. It's been abandoned, and it looks like, and our name is still, the panels are all messed up and everything. We got to figure out whether to tear it out or tear down our signs or something, because it's frankly, it looks like an abandoned WPA project. And you know, our name is all over the thing. So I'd like to report on that too.
Just the two things?
Huh?
Just those two?
No, but that's for tonight.
I should, okay.
Stay tuned, right?
Yeah.
I will provide a brief response to the Richfield project, and we can bring back a more formal report. So I think the last time that we briefed the board, we talked about the project's non-performance, some of the issues that we'd identified that needed troubleshooting over the course of 2019, and our, I think, general level of dissatisfaction with how those had been shot, and then reported back to, and the communication back to the watershed district. At that time, we reported to the board that we'd be going to have a meeting with the city manager and their public works staff that are operating the facility, and so that's something that I did with Becky Christopher before she went on maternity leave, to relay our concerns and convey the board's concerns about our ongoing financial commitment in light of the performance issues. And the public works staff and city manager at that time had committed to transitioning to a different engineer. They were looking at Bar Engineering at the time and sitting down with us and proactively mapping out the troubleshooting steps that were going to take place in 2020 and how we would be involved every step of the way, because we communicated we need to be reporting back in more real time to the board what adjustments are being made, what the results are, so that we can determine by the end of 2020 what decision the board wants to make vis-a-vis its ongoing financial commitment to servicing the debt. So that's where we currently stand. That's getting framed up in written correspondence back to the city so that we have another data point of documenting. And then once we start working with Bar Engineer or whoever they select as they're moving away from WSB, we'll be able to communicate back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It just occurred to me that our secretary is absent. We have resolutions that need to be signed, so I could appoint a secretary pro tem to get them signed this evening. Manager Miller, may I appoint you?
Sure.
Um,
Oh, no, I'm not going to sign it, because...
Oh, I forgot.
No, I can't, my handwriting is terrible. We do sign.
It doesn't have to be
The
legible.
resolution's not going to get signed.
Mr. Whisker?
Yeah, I'll sign them.
It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't.
Okay, I'll sign.
Manager Maxwell, is there, I think I need a motion on
Yeah,
that
let's
one.
do a motion.
Move
Appoint
approval.
Manager Miller, is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Manager Loftus. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Super briefly,
All right.
a few items for you. And we can discuss as furthermore as the managers would like, but I just wanted to add a couple of notes and didn't really see a better spot to do this. Number one, the Minnesota Association of City Attorneys met last week, had their annual conference and so on and so forth, and had a item on the panel with regard to Atlas 14 and problems with city stormwater infrastructure statewide. So I think the takeaway from that is that it's very interesting that that is on the city attorney's radar, and an issue they're paying attention to, and nervous about from a liability
Okay.
exposure perspective. Second thing, the Minnesota Association of Watershed Responsibility, Mr. Whiskers provided some background on that organization. They appear to be back in action, notwithstanding having gotten the permits that at least one permit that they were seeking for a large organization or a large project, and getting solicitations out to watersheds for data requests. So watch that in the legislative session. As the managers will recall, they brought forward what was called the Developers Bill of Rights, and that doesn't look like it's going to go away. Then finally, following up on an item that some of the managers heard at the Metro Minnesota Association of Watershed Districts, it was reported that the Friends of the Mississippi would be taking the lead on the legislative action to install liability limitations associated with chloride. That is not the case. Clean Water Action looks like they're going to be taking the lead on it in the legislative session. And there was a meeting with PCA, Friends of Mississippi, Clean Water Action, and some others about the issues around that. Some of the issues that the PCA has about collecting fees to be able to administer that program to certify people so they can take advantage of the limitation.
Thank you.
That's all I got for you.
We are adjourned.